We're back now with Senator Bruce Tarr, who is the Senate Minority Leader in the state of Massachusetts here. Senator, welcome back.
Good afternoon. Great to be here with you, Rick and Bill.
Thank you very much, sir. Nothing going on as usual, but let's start with the most recent topic on tartalk.com, and that has to do with something called the Patients First Act.
So that was actually passed yesterday in the Senate, Rick. So it was a pretty big day of formal debate in the Senate. And just to recap, you know that we have a new set of rules for formal sessions. And so for these sessions now, a member can either be on the floor of the Senate or be in their office or be at home participating remotely. And so yesterday's bill had 70 amendments filed. So it was a long day of discussion. Most of the amendments got resolved one way or the other in a very good fashion. And in the end, we wound up passing, I think, a very strong bill. And there are essentially three components to it. One is making sure that we continue to have telemedicine available because it's proven to be so valuable in the time of the pandemic, being able to get people health care that they might not otherwise be able to access. And so the bill says that insurers have to continue to pay for telemedicine in the same way that they would pay for an office visit or an in-person visit, and does that for 2 years. Now, very importantly, one of the amendments that I successfully added to the bill says that in that 2 years, we have to figure out a rate structure for going forward. So right now, we are paying for a lot of things that may or may not be considered traditionally as part of telemedicine. So we want to make sure that going forward, we're going to spend 2 years figuring out the right rate structure so that we can have these services available for the foreseeable future. So that's number one. Number two, we've had too many instances of surprise billing during the pandemic, and that occurs because someone goes to a healthcare provider that's not in the network of their insurer. And that's been happening because choices are limited during the pandemic. And so this bill bans that surprise billing and treats that provider as if they were in the network for the purposes of billing right now. And then also directs a couple of our state agencies to look at, in the future again, after a couple of years, to look at what the rate structure should look like when you go out of network. And then the last piece really has to do with expanding the scope of practice for some healthcare providers so that we can have more choices for people to be able to go to. Things like, particularly with dentistry, being able to go to different kind of dental practitioners and different kinds of nurses to be able to provide services. So 3 legs on this stool. It's a very strong bill. It passed the Senate unanimously, and it now goes to the House, and we hope they'll take it up soon.
You could have 4 legs on a stool, though, right, Senator? I mean, you could, right? Yeah.
Well, you know, Bill, usually it would be me that would be trying to add a 4th in this process, but I didn't do that in this case because we wanted to really try to keep the bill fairly narrow so that we could increase its chance of passage in a timely way. But, oh yeah, Bill, and it wouldn't be beyond us to try to conduct or construct a 5-legged stool as well.
Speaking of stools, as I transition, what's the latest with restaurants? Restaurant Association, and obviously restaurants have been able to reopen in a limited way of late.
You know, Bill, they've been hit very hard. And one of the things that happened a few days ago is that the Senate held a listening session to hear how people are thinking about the reopening of our economy during the pandemic. And some of the most troubling testimony was offered by the Mass Restaurant Association about what prospects look like. So among the things they said to us is that as many as 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 restaurants may not be able to reopen. And that's because a lot of them have not had the ability to do takeout food service the way some have. And many of them don't have the ability to do outdoor dining right now. And so you can now do indoor dining, but that's a recent development as we went to step 2 of phase 2 of reopening. So they are still hit very, very hard. And Bob Lutz, who's been working with us from the Restaurant Association, has been in constant contact about the things that we can do to help them. But, you know, think about this. A lot of the people that work in restaurants have lost their jobs. Others are not being tipped the way that they used to because the atmosphere is not the way that it was. So there are a lot of concerns for what might happen with the restaurant industry going forward. And of course, we're trying to do everything we can to be helpful to them.
Well,
I, I was just gonna say, Bill, I've been tipping more than usual. And I always do the minimum 20%, but I find that strange that people aren't tipping as much as they used to.
Rick, the issue has been usually we associate a tip with table service.
Right.
And so during the pandemic, there has been no table service. There's been a lot more takeout. And according to the folks at the Mass Restaurant Association, that has meant that people haven't viewed tipping that way. Now, I do the same thing as you do. When I go for takeout, I try to give a very generous tip, but that hasn't happened across the board.
I didn't realize that. That's not cool. Senator, do I understand there will be a sales tax holiday this year?
There will be. It's required in statute, and the only issue is going to be how it comes about. So in the current statute, there's a default date by which, if the legislature doesn't act, then the administration picks the date. And it appears that the way we're going right now, that it'll be the administration that picks the date of the sales tax holiday. And part of the uncertainty, Rick, is that there has been a belief that the element of sort of uncertainty is important here, so people don't plan a year's worth of purchases around a date that's absolutely set in stone. To be honest, I'm not really sure about the efficacy of that, but that's what's reflected in the statute. So there will be a sales tax holiday, and it's my best estimate right now that the date will be established by the governor.
yeah, I did see a date published, but it probably was obviously a tentative date in late August or something like that. Hey, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Senator.
Bill, I'm pretty confident that that's when it's going to be. It's probably going to be the last weekend in August at this point. And the reason that that date is being discussed so much is because it will coincide with returning back to school and folks buying things for school supplies, which is one of the original reasons that we had a sales tax holiday.
Exactly. Well, speaking of schools, as we transition so very well with you today, Senator, the governor spoke on schools yesterday. Department of Ed spoke. DESE will be speaking with additional guidance coming July. So what is your take on what we're hearing on schools and what you're hearing on the ground as well, basically?
So we've got to see a lot of guidance yesterday that was not only reflected in the governor's remarks, but also by information that was sent out by Department of Elementary and Secondary Education Commissioner Riley. And it is voluminous, Bill, and we're still reading through it. But some basic things include schools should have a 3-component plan. And part one of that plan would be to have in-person learning the way that we traditionally do, with new restrictions, of course. The second one would be to have a hybrid between having some learning done remotely and some in person. And the third would be to have total remote learning in the case that that's necessary. So basically what DESE is saying is we want schools to give us their plans. Here are the elements that need to be included in the plans, and then we'll move forward. I think the one very large takeaway message from this whole thing is that this is a situation that's evolving. It is fluid. And what we saw yesterday, in my humble opinion, won't be to the letter what we ultimately see. But it was meant to get the conversation started, and it is very, very descriptive of what DESE wants to see in these plans. Now, one of the things, Bill, that's very interesting is there's discussion right now, there actually is a rule right now about having no more than 10 students in a classroom for summer programs. And so there's been some thought that that may carry into the fall as well. But of course, if you do that, then you're going to need more classroom space and you're going to need more teachers. And so one of the things that I found very interesting in the guidance that was issued yesterday was a suggestion to begin looking at common areas like auditoriums and cafeterias that you're probably not going to be able to use when we return to school, and maybe converting that space to additional classroom space to minimize the need for additional new construction.
You know, I saw like 3 takeaways from that. One was that there was no plan that brought it back to the way it was, right? There's no
That's correct.
basically 25 kids in a classroom or 30, whatever it might have been or could have been. That's not one of the plans. Also that you meant then lunches within classrooms, so no cafeterias, which would be a major, logistical piece for schools to handle. And then the other thing the commissioner mentioned was that some schools or some classrooms, that the substantially separate special ed classrooms may have to go on every day because of the needs of the children would be so much different than other children. I thought that was very encouraging, at least to hear that piece.
Absolutely. And Bill, there are other important elements too, like the wearing of masks for students and for teachers and educators and administrators. And one of the important things about that is that schools are thinking, how are we going to meet these new costs of being able to pay for masks and sanitizer and other kinds of things? Now, what the guidance says is that for students, the masks will be the responsibility of parents, but for everyone else, it'll be the responsibility of schools. And one of the things that was in the guidance is the announcement by the governor of a $200 million plus or minus fund to help schools with those kinds of costs. And in rough numbers, they're looking at about $225 per student for these eligible costs. So there are a lot of details to this that still need to be worked out as we move forward.
Tremendous amount of information today. Thank you, Senator. Stay safe and have a great weekend.
Well, thanks. You too, Rick, and you too, Bill. I really appreciate the chance to be back on with you and look forward to doing it again soon.